Exodus chapter 4. The title, What's That in Your Hand? Ordinary People was a movie back in the 1980s featuring Donald Sutherland, who's the father of Kiefer Sutherland from 24, Alan Alda from MASH, and Mary Tyler Moore. Its setting was suburban Chicago, but could have been anywhere in the United States or anywhere on the North Shore for that matter. The drama was a new one for Hollywood. It did not feature superheroes or supervillains. It did not show leading men sweeping leading women off their Gucci-strapped feet. It zoomed in on four people who lived ordinary lives. And that was the whole show. Obviously, there was more than that, as every good screenwriter will tell you. Characterization is not easy with just a little action, as Samuel Beckett so powerfully demonstrated in his classic Waiting for Godot. It's not normal to think that our lives are normal. Let me repeat that so you don't miss it. It's not normal to think that our lives are normal. The world and the media and the sensationalists of the commercial marketplace want you to think that being you is not enough. It's inadequate. You must become someone else. You must be remade into Kylie or Madonna. You must fast bowl like Mitchell Johnson or snowboard like Tora Bright. Human isn't human enough. Superhuman is required for notice. And by inference, if you're not superhuman, you should attempt to be so. You watch all the late-night infomercials, and you'll find that if you just buy another product, your clothes will be fresher, your food will taste better, your body will be resculptured, and you will find true happiness. Internet dating, or simply ringing a phone number, will give us relationships, and will have meaning and relevance. See how easy it is? Wait, did I miss something? Is ordinary so wrong? Is being who we are so bad? Why are we so malcontent with ourselves and longing to be something more? In today's story, our Jewish people are in the valley moaning. We've been doing so for 400 years, according to the earlier chapters. And up on the mountain, God is making provision to answer their prayers. What? You say, after 400 years, what took him so long? We'll have to ask him when we see him. In the meantime, we take it at face value. God is teaching us something about being content with him in our ordinary selves. Now, last week we began looking at the conversation between Moses and God. I'm not sure why the men who divided up the Bible chose to stop chapter 3 where they did. Let's review it for a moment. Remember, Moses is giving God excuse after excuse in his attempt to divert God from making Moses go to Pharaoh. Remember, he's already offered up to God 2 excuses found in Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 13. What were those 2 excuses? So what is he saying? What's his excuse? I'm ignorant. I don't know. That's his second excuse. What's his first excuse? Who am I? Meaning I'm an identity question, an excuse. I'm not the guy. I'm not any big celebrity. I'm a nobody, in other words. I'm not an identity you need to go up against the big guy. And secondly, I'm not very smart, man. I'm ignorant. In other words, God answered Moses by saying that God was enough in every situation, and thus Moses did not need to worry. God also took Moses on a futuristic view with a sequence of events that would take place. That's chapter 3, 19 to 22. But to that guarantee of God's plan, Moses almost defiantly, certainly emphatically, declared his problem. So, today's story picks up with more excuses. Listen, in verse 1, what does it say? What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? What if they won't believe me? What's another way of saying this? What's his excuse? I'm not very convincing, credible, charismatic. I'm not very convincing. I'm not your guy. I can't make all those people believe. I'm no David Copperfield. I'm no somebody. I've never been to Hillsong. I don't know how to run a big show. What is God's answer to Moses? God gives him 3 signs to help him. Who do you think might be the most surprised Jew on the planet just about now? And that'd be Moses. Wow, my stick became a snake. What happens next? I mean, these are pretty significant things, right? He says, I tell you what, I'll give you 3, not 3 guesses, I'll give you 3 convincing proofs that are representing me. You're right, you're not convincing. I'm going to give you 3 things to make it work. Your stick will become a snake, your hand will become that of a leper and come back again, and you're going to have some drinking water that becomes blood. That ought to work. What's the purpose of this? God is convincing Moses of God's power and presence. God is able to make all things done in his purpose. And Moses, the sooner you learn this, the better. Moses ran away, it says, at the stick-to-snake manifestation. To Moses' excuse number 3, I'm not convincing. God says, I'm very convincing even to you. I'm going to convince you that I'm the boss and I'm going to make it happen all over Egypt. So what's that in your hand? Think about it in verse 2. What's a staff? Sounds significant. What's a shepherd's rod? It's a piece of wood. What do we call that in the back of a building? What do we call that in the bush? It's a stick. It's an ordinary stick that's been shaped, maybe carved a little. Maybe it's a little more substantial than a thin stick, but it's not a trunk of a tree. It's not massive. It is just a stick. It's an ordinary staff, used by the shepherds of Midian, and no doubt by all the folks then, and to this day, who need to guide themselves over the unstable footing and to lead sheep into ways of the shepherd's choosing. It's almost a GPS for men in those days, leading people to find their way out of wilderness situations. So God takes the ordinary stick and gives it significance. He says that he'll lead us out of the situations of pain and despair. He will adjust things to his purposes, and he will dominate. Are you getting the point? God will use you. You're just ordinary people. Listening here in the Bible study, listening on the internet, listening anywhere, to his purposes. Ordinary people. God uses us all the time. We'll talk a bit more about this soon. Excuse number 4. So after Moses makes the startling assertions that the elders of Israel won't listen to him, basically calling God an unaware old fellow, almost calling God a liar, we see Moses turn again to his own inability. After the 3 magic acts, in verse 10 we read this, Lord, I've never been eloquent. His excuse is about his own inability to speak. He says, I'm not eloquent. So I'm not anybody. I'm not informed. I'm not convincing. Number 4, I'm not eloquent. I'm not. You get it? Hey, God, if you want to convince the people, send an orator like Barack Obama. I mean, he's good. He's a great speech. How about Martin Luther King Jr.? I have a dream. Billy Graham, Nelson Mandela, a presenter on the BBC, a Jeffrey Rush. Shakespeare. Yeah, I mean, come on, get some guys who know how to talk. I am not one of those talkers. You're barking up the wrong tree, Moses says. Look, some of you will know the story of the legend of Moses' lisp. He may or may not have had a speech impediment. Do you know the story? It's a legend. Stephen, in his final defense in the book of Acts chapter 7, says nothing about it. He says, Moses was educated, verse 22, in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. But the legend of Moses' lisp reflects something different. Here's the story. The young toddler Moses was in Pharaoh's court. So the Pharaoh was worried that this young interloper would want his throne. So he gave him a test. He figured he'd put 2 bright-colored objects in front of him. One was a bowl of diamonds and jewels, and the other was a bowl of hot coals. Both glowed. So those both were, of course, an attraction to young Moses. So the Pharaoh thought if Moses reached for the jewels, Pharaoh would take it to mean that Moses was reaching for Pharaoh's crown and could not be trusted. If he reached elsewhere, the king could relax. So you guessed it, the boy reached for the jewels, but an angel moved his hand, and Moses took the coals, and like every small boy, including my grandson, he put the contents into his mouth. Thus the coals made Moses' lips and tongue to burn, and he lisped to his dying day. And whether it's true or not, the excuse is not really about impediments, but about eloquence. He's not saying, I can't give a good speech. He's saying, I'm not eloquent. He excuses himself, but of course God answers again, not about Moses, but about God. He replies, I made man's mouth. I will be with your mouth. It's not about you, Moses. It's about God. So now we're at verse 13 of chapter 4, and this is the final excuse, of course. It's the one we never really want to admit. It's the one that will ruin all the relationship that God wants to have with us. It's about our will and our volition. It sounds so positive, and yet it is violently negative. Please, Lord, send the message to Pharaoh by whomever you will. What has God already said about his will? Well, maybe it's sycophantic, but if it were, the edict has already been issued. You could see that as an act of humility. Tell you what, God, this whole conversation's been very interesting. I'm here at the bush that's burning. I tell you what, send somebody. Really, whoever you want. It can't be me. Why does he say it can't be me? Because he's humble? Okay, I'll give you that. Because he knows that with the touch of the Almighty comes glory and honor and greatness, and he doesn't want that. That's very generous of you. Let me see, what does verse 14 say? Moses says, verse 13, please, Lord, send the message by whomever you will. The nobility of the prayer is met by the anger of God. That doesn't make sense. Why would God get angry at the missionary zealous prayer of Moses? He's an 80-year-old man. He's been 40 years on the backside of the wilderness living with his wife in a faraway place, far away from the trouble he had 40 years ago. Moses is asking God to send laborers into his harvest. He's asking for God to orchestrate the exile of the Jewish people. He wants the hand of God to be visible, doesn't he? But you see, if you know the answer to the prayer and the will of God, and you ask God to do something else, and there's the key, your deed may better be titled rebellion than prayer. I'm going to say that again. If you know the answer to the prayer, and you know the will of God, and you ask God to do something else, your deed may better be titled rebellion than prayer. It is the final excuse, the one of reluctance, where Moses gets in trouble the most. Moses has said, I'm not anyone, I'm not informed, I'm not convincing, I'm not eloquent. But the summary of his excuses is verse 13, I'm not willing. Friends, excuse yourself all day long and others may believe you. Tell them the dog ate your homework or that you are tired. Tell them that other pressing needs are coming in, like tending daily to your father for an indeterminate amount of time, or the purchase of a property, or your car needs constant attention. There's always a reason to dismiss the plans and purposes of God. There are those who admire others. So take your example of cave dwellers who are comfortable in their caves, who have 2.5 cars and 2.5 children, I think that's the average, and they are living in suburbia, and they're doing fine, thank you very much, and God tells them to go to Israel or Ethiopia or Australia, Zambia, and go serve for a week, for a month, for a year, forever. And they say, yeah, that can't be God. So then they hear that I'm going, or you're going, or this one, or this whole team of people are going. They say, I so applaud them, and I admire them, and here's $50, and here's $100, and send me your prayer letter, and I'll pray, and it's all good. I have no problem with somebody not going to Uganda, or to Zimbabwe, or to inner city Sydney. I have no problem with people not doing that unless they've been told by God to go do that. Not everybody's supposed to go everywhere. Everybody's supposed to go somewhere and to someone. That doesn't mean to everyone. I'm not called to everyone. I don't know anybody in this Bible study who's supposed to go to everyone. I don't know anyone anywhere who's supposed to go to everyone, but we all together can go to everyone if we do that. So there's always a reason to dismiss the plans and purposes of the Almighty, but when you boil it down to the final excuse, you have to ask yourself, are you willing to obey Him? Are you willing to do the uncomfortable? I read yesterday about a man named Tolik, one of our missionaries in Kiev, Ukraine. He's visiting yesterday a Jewish man in the CBD of Kiev when the rioting broke out again. You know, yesterday over 20 people were killed in the city. The subway trains shut down. The government shut down. It's a harsh time. It's a dangerous time to be living in Kiev. And in the midst of it, there's Tolik sitting and sharing the gospel with a Jewish man. Undeterred, bold. He's not one to make an excuse to God. And he would have had plenty of reasons to make excuses. And no one would have faulted him, would they? No, the trains aren't running. I mean, you don't even have to make up an excuse. The world's violent. I could get killed. I might say, why don't you call that guy? Why don't you make a phone call and have a visit with him that way? But he went undeterred to go see him, and I think, kudos. Consider our colleagues in Israel. At the end of last year, and Rachel went along, they went out on the streets in Beersheba and Arad and shared Messiah. Arad is really unsafe. It's a harsh place, dangerous place. And yet every day our teams were out there sharing Messiah. They stood out boldly when others were getting in their faces trying to shame them and prevent their gospel proclamation. And yet each day they went out, handing out thousands and thousands of tracts, speaking to hundreds on the telephone, and at the end, over 800 unbelieving Jewish people gave us their contact information for further follow-up. No excuses. I use these folks as wonderful examples in contrast to Moses. They made no excuse to God. They came, they paid money and served among us, and they're still serving. I honor them today. What is the work of an ordinary person? What must we do to work the works of God? This is a question from the Gospel of John. You definitely do ordinary things. What is that which people said, what must I do to work the works of God? John chapter 6, I don't have the reference. Believe in the one who was sent, he said. This is the work of God, that you believe in the one whom he has sent. Moses is basically saying the same thing. To work God's works in God's ways, we must have the faith of the Son of God working and shaping us each day. Our ordinariness, our being ordinary, is not a surprise to God. He made us, after all. He wants us to know him and to love him, and at times to be used by him to do his work. Don't give him an excuse. Trust him to help you do what he asks, and you will give God great praise through your life as a result. Let's read the end here of chapter 4. We've already seen the excuses. We've seen God's anger, but look at God's provision. Where's verse 14? Is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? Isn't that a funny thing to call him? Why should you call your brother the Levite? What does that make Moses?
A Levite.
He's a Levite also. Why would you call him Aaron the Levite? I really don't know. I looked it up in a lot of places, and to be fair, I think it's clever what some people say, but I don't get it. It's just one of those questions I'll ask God when I get there. I know, verse 14, that he speaks fluently. By the way, I should tell you, there was a Hebrew phrase we looked at, which is translated, verse 8. If they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of the last sign. If they won't believe the two signs, then do the water into blood thing. Right? So what was the first sign? The stick. Right. What was the second sign? Leprosy. So he says, if they won't believe you or heed, verse 8, the witness, but what's the Hebrew word there? Kol, meaning voice of the first sign. Here's his excuse. He's saying, I don't have eloquence. I can't communicate. I'm not convincing. He says, the sign will be the voice. It will speak to the people. If they won't give heed to the kol of the first sign, the ot, if they won't believe you, verse 8, or heed the witness, the kol of the first sign, they may believe the kol of the last sign. So things that are signs, ot, are designed to be voices to people who listen. Real quickly, just flip to Mark chapter 8. Just listen to this, and I'll try to help you through it. Yeshua has just performed a miracle, and he's told the boys to feed everybody who's there. And according to the story here, they had fed 5,000 people. That was just in the recent past, and now he's going to do it again with another big crowd. In verse 3, he says, well, if I send them away hungry, they'll faint on the way, and some of them obviously won't make it. So in verse 4, he tells the disciples, verse 5, he says, let's feed these guys. How many do we have? He says, we got 7 loaves. Okay, that'll work. In verse 6, he tells the people to sit down, and he gives thanks, and he breaks it and gives it out to the disciples, who give it out to the people. And they gave out a few small fish, so some lox and bagel. Everything was good. And after he blessed them, he served those as well. They ate. They picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. 7 out, 7 back. 4,000 were there, verse 9. And he sent them away. That is a great story. Then they get into the boat and they go across the Sea of Galilee to this unknown place called Dalmanutha. And the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him. Look what it says, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Verse 11 is very important. Get this down, you'll get it. The Pharisees came out and argued with him. That's okay. And sought a sign from heaven. That's okay. To test him, that's not okay. He had just done a sign. Probably had just done 2 signs. So these guys heard about it and said, hey, you, David Copperfield, do a trick for us. And he sighed deeply, I love that in verse 12, in his spirit, and said, why does this generation seek for a sign? A Simeon, remember? And he said, no sign will be given to this generation. Now, is that true? No sign will be given this generation. You think, well, wait a minute. He just did a sign for this generation. And he's going to do another one at the end of the chapter. So what does that mean? What he's saying is no sign will be good enough for this generation. How do I know that? Because of what he says in verse 18. I'll get there in a moment. So leaving again, he embarks and goes to the other side. They forgot to take bread. They didn't want to they only had 1 loaf. He embarks and goes to the other side. They forgot bread, verse 14. The disciples forgot bread. We've just had a miracle of 7 loaves to feed 4,000 men, and they forget bread. They've only got 1 loaf in their backpack. Oh, great. So he gave orders to them. He said, be careful, watch out, verse 15. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Pharisees and Herod. And they said, wait a minute, we don't have any bread. And Yeshua, verse 17, aware of it, said, why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Don't you see or understand? Do you have a heart that's hard? Having eyes, verse 18, don't you see? Having ears, do you not hear? Don't you remember I did these miracles? I did the feeding when we had 5,000 people. How many baskets picked up? 12. How many after 4,000? 7. He says, don't you yet understand? So here's the deal. Seeing a miracle doesn't make for anything. It is a voice that speaks, but if your ears are plugged, even a voice of a miracle is silent to you. In other words, if you have eyes but you don't see and ears but you don't hear, it's because you don't want to hear. And it's not that you can't see, it's that you won't see. It's the unwillingness that Moses depicted in his 5th excuse. That's the reason for some of these Pharisees who were there to test him. They were saying, hey, do the sign thing. Because he said, what? I just did. Were you not seeing that? How many times do you hear that in the Gospels? How often shall I be with you? I've made it clear. People say, I put up a Facebook update. If you were God, what would you change? Now, what that really means is if you had God's powers, what would you change? Because if you were God, you wouldn't change anything because God is God and he hasn't changed anything. So maybe I should say, if God were you, what would you change? But really, if you were given the power of God to do anything on the planet, what would you change? And people are putting up last year's results in Super Bowl or, this thing or that thing. And some were saying, I'd take away all suffering, I'd make all the world better. I would, said several of them, I would show myself and cut out this 6,000 years of trust me without showing myself. I think, wow, he has shown himself so demonstrably, but he hasn't popped onto the scene like Iron Man in Iron Man 2, was it, where he took off his mask, or 3. He hasn't done the Superman, hi, I'm Clark Kent thing. He is behind the scenes, and that's the story of Purim. We're going to have a great time in a couple weeks as we celebrate Purim. This idea of miracles don't create anything except give voice to the plan of God, the visible God who really wants to communicate to us. He sometimes does miracles. He does that. Not the birth of a baby or every breath, but I mean real miracles. We've seen so much and we demand so much more. Back in Exodus 4, verse 14, this phrase, I know that he speaks fluently, it says in our version. But the Hebrew is just a repeat of the word diber. Here's the deal. Beware the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees. What are those two? What do they represent? Okay, politics and religion. Politics and Herod, they're both authorities, and Pharisaic tutorial, teaching, that kind of thing. So he says, beware of them, because those guys say they are the authorities. Yeshua said, I'm the one. All the while he's saying, I'm the one. Now here he says, so this is my answer to you, Moses would run what? The political power, and Aaron would run the theological power, say, the priesthood. Always separate those things. When church and state merge, it's never good for either or for anyone. Philip Turner wrote the book, I forget the title, I apologize, but it's he uses the three vows of Catholic priests. Obedience, so it's power; purity, so it's sex; and poverty. So he says, money, sex, and power. I think that might be the name of the book. And the fourth one is silence, so he talks about the use of tongue and language and stuff. But he argues that Constantinianism, which is the merging of church and state in 325, is the worst thing that ever happened on the planet. I'm not looking at 4th century. I'm talking about it throughout history. It's the worst thing on the planet. And it is never good when church and state can gather together. Look what happened to our people when the church, Russian Orthodox, and the state, Russia, were in charge. And so we get pogroms and pomyat, and we get atheism perpetrated through our people for 70 years and maybe 100 years or maybe 500 years. You see the hostility of church and state in Germany and in various countries in Europe. And thankfully we don't have it in Australia. Inquisition, when the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, merged their governmental authority, and Torquemada comes in with the church authority, and the Inquisition is all over us, and it's horrible. I like that he speaks fluently. I like that double use of the word davar in verse 14. I know that he speaks speakingly. Daber yedaber. Moreover, he's coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he'll be glad in his heart. That's real sameach. This is going to be great. Simcha. You're to speak to him, put the words in his mouth. Even I will be with your mouth in his mouth. I will teach you what you're to do. So the answer to every one of our inabilities is God's ability. The answer to every one of our excuses is God will be there. I'm not, we say, God says, I am. I'm not, God says, I will. Moreover, he shall speak, verse 16, for you to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and you'll be as God to him. It's a nice, clear picture. Take the staff. He returned to Jethro, his father, and said, hey, I got to go. He said, go. After 40 years of living in his father-in-law's community, he's not exiled. He leaves comfortably. Took the wife, the sons, went on the donkey, took the staff. What's it called in verse 20? What's the staff called? The staff of God. This is not Moses' staff anymore. Yes. This is God's staff. He owns it, and he's empowered it. Yeah, that's right. So then there's this circumcision thing we're not going to talk about, not this time. Verse 29, Moses told Aaron all the words, and Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the sons of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs in the sight of the people, so the people believed. The Hebrew, Ya Amen. The people said, Amen. Amen. Yeah. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed low and worshiped. This is what worship is. It's not a singing section at the beginning of a musical concert called church. Worship is bowing low, it's silent, it's humility, and it's thankfulness, it's deep, it's personal, and it's a response to who God is. That's chapter 4. What's that in your hand? Staff of Moses becomes the staff of God. Excuses, irrelevant. Laid them low. If they're in your mouth, drop them. Give them up. And honor God with your being. Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for the group you've gathered together that we might study this. Thank you for our friends on the internet who are studying along with us. We pray that each of us here in this room and in their rooms would be brought closer to you, would make no excuses to you, and would follow Yeshua with all their heart. This we ask in the name of Yeshua.